Tonight, a 360 interview with a key arson scientist who is convinced that Texas executed a man for a crime he did not commit. We've been following the case of Cameron Todd Willingham for years, and in recent weeks, the controversy has heated up, with more than half a dozen forensic investigators now saying Willingham did not set the 1991 fire that killed his 3 daughters. Governor Rick Perry, who removed 4 members of a state panel revisiting the evidence, says Willingham was a monster and guilty of murder. But just before the execution, Perry's office received a fax from Gerald Hurst, an arson expert whose report raised some disturbing questions that continue to mount. Randy Kay is in Texas tonight and spoke to Hurst. Here's her keeping him honest report.
Just 88 minutes before Cameron Todd Willingham's execution, this man was his last dying hope. Do you believe there was overwhelming evidence that Todd Willingham was guilty?
There was not the slightest iota of evidence. There is no evidence that this was arson. None. Zero. Zip.
Gerald Hurst, a nationally recognized fire investigator, was the first to sound the alarm, contending that Todd Willingham's conviction was based on flawed forensic evidence used to show he set the 1991 fire that killed his 3 girls. The lawyer handling Willingham's appeal had asked Hurst to review the case just 3 weeks before execution day. If you're saying there was no evidence of arson and he was convicted of arson homicide and sentenced to death, should he have been executed?
Absolutely not. It is bogus from the get-go.
Bogus, Hurst says, because the prosecution's fire investigators based their findings on, quote, folklore and junk science. Not fact, not the science used today. So Hurst wrote this 5-page memo, signed February 13th, 2004, 4 days before the execution, warning Texas Governor Rick Perry that critical errors were made in interpreting the evidence that led to Willingham's conviction. Still, Willingham was executed less than an hour and a half, 88 minutes, after Hurst's memo reached the governor's office. You were the guy who got that memo to the governor's office.
Yes.
The first one to say, wait a minute, hold on, this guy may be innocent, this was not an arson fire.
Yes.
Yet, nothing was done with your findings.
Well, it feels terrible, of course.
The governor's office told us, quote, Hurst's report was no more than an opinion and did not merit reopening the case.
What did Gerald Hurst expect when his memo was sent to Governor Perry?
Anderson, Hurst told me that he was hoping that the governor would grant Willingham a 30-day stay. He was hoping that would give them some time to bring in another expert, maybe even some more than just one expert who would support his findings. He said he had no doubt in his mind that these other experts would agree with him and also figure out that this was not a case of arson at all.
What does he think about the governor replacing 4 members of the state commission, which was, at the time, investigating whether or not this execution was, in fact, inappropriate?
We talked about that, and we also talked about the fact that this new commission and the new commissioners still have not yet set a date to discuss this investigation. No new hearing date on the calendar. Listen to what Gerald Hurst had to say about that.
Fully expected him as a politician to find a way to quash the investigation of the Willingham case. But I thought it would be done in a more sophisticated behind-the-scenes maneuvering. I did not expect him to simply take out an axe and start lopping the heads off commissioners.
For the record, the terms of these commissioners were up. The governor could have kept them on longer, but he has said that he didn't want to because he didn't want to replace commissioners in the middle of this investigation once it got underway. And also, for the record, he still stands by his decision. He says that Cameron Todd Willingham was a monster and that there was overwhelming evidence that he was guilty.
Did you ask Hurst what he thought of Willingham's defense team?
I did. He told me really that Willingham didn't have a defense. In fact, he used the word zero in describing his defense. He really wonders, as many others do, how the prosecution was able to find 2 arson investigators to put on the stand for the jury who said that this case was arson, this fire was arson. Meanwhile, the defense could not find an expert to refute that. They couldn't find anyone to actually talk to the defense attorney today, and we'll have that full interview for you tomorrow night on 360.
And just for those who haven't been following, at this point, how many arson experts, forensic scientists have come forward and saying that this was junk science that these folks used?
Gerald Hurst was the first, and there have been 8 others since, so a total of 9 investigators. And these are experts who are Harvard-educated, Cambridge-educated, nationally recognized experts.
All right, Randy, keep on it. Thanks. Gerald Hurst says the prosecution's arson expert used discredited techniques to make his case that Williams set the fire. while Hearst disputes the evidence, he will not say if he thinks Willingham is innocent. Senior legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin joins us now with insight into the case. So Governor Perry's office received this fax. We don't know for a fact he read it. Is he under any legal obligation to read this?
No, this is one of the areas where a governor has almost complete freedom to make a decision. It's probably the most important thing any governor does, which is make the life or death decision about execution. But there's no formal standard. He can decide. He doesn't even have to read it if he doesn't want to. He can simply rubber stamp what the courts have done. For however he reached the agreement, the decision, Perry decided to let the execution go forward.
And what's at stake for the governor? I mean, if it turns out that this was not arson, which would then certainly mean that the reason this man was convicted was false, I mean, what's the implication for the governor?
Well, it depends how you look at it. In the narrow term, he is now involved in a very hot re-election fight. He's in a Republican primary with Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson. This has become an issue in that campaign. If he wins the nomination, he will have a general election to deal with. But frankly, I think his biggest concern is simply a moral issue. This is about taking someone's life. And the evidence, even then, was pretty clear that Willingham was innocent, but now it is overwhelming that he's innocent.
What's amazing is, I mean, it's not just Willingham. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of cases, not only just in Texas, but around the country, of people who have been convicted based on evidence which is now considered to be junk science.
Well, this is an issue we've talked about a lot, and it is so important because lots of times in the criminal justice system, experts sort of got to be considered experts by tradition, by folklore, as Randy's piece said. Dogs being used to trace people through the woods, totally unreliable. This sort of arson investigation, very unreliable.
Even ballistic evidence, it turns out to be...
Ballistic evidence, hair and fiber evidence. The growth and acceptance of DNA evidence, which is totally reliable, has served to point out how many other forms of forensic science, CSI notwithstanding, are actually not very reliable.
So is there any procedure to kind of look back at folks who are in prison now based on junk science?
There's not any formal procedure.
The
Innocence Project has tried to reopen cases, but that's very hard to do. The evidence is often not preserved. But looking forward, the National Academy of Sciences has tried to set out some standards for the future of forensic science so that courts only accept legitimate science in the future. That effort is picking up steam. It's not done, but it's a huge issue.
Yeah, amazing. Jeff, appreciate it. Jeff Toobin, thank you very much. Still ahead.